Families and supporters of Israeli hostages held captive by Hamas in Gaza have set out on a 4-day march to Jerusalem to call for the release of their loved ones. Joining us from Jerusalem is the Executive Manager at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, Joel Burnie. Joel, thank you so much for joining us on Power Hour. You arrived in Israel just recently. Can you speak to us about this visit of yours? It must be a difficult one and no doubt an emotional one for you as well.
Thanks for having me, Gabriella. Look, this is the second time that I've been to Israel since the horrific events of October the 7th. I've been here many, many times, and the place is completely different. The reminder of bringing back the hostages is everywhere to see. Streets are still relatively empty, and the majority of families here have either been impacted directly through one of their family members or friends or people they know that have been murdered on October 7, or if they have kids or family members that are now fighting in Gaza. So it's a different place. And unfortunately, because of the events of October the 7th, Israel will never be the same again. So whilst I'm very, very happy to be here, and whilst I'm very happy to be able to come here and show solidarity with the people of Israel who have gone through such a tough time, it is critically important that not just Jewish people around the world, but everyone around the world understands exactly what's going on here. And the only true way to know that is by coming here and seeing it for oneself.
Absolutely. Can you speak to us about the Hostages and Missing Families Forum and the demonstration that is taking place? Are we any closer to bringing the hostages home?
Look, there's a lot of back and forward. We know that negotiations have been going on in earnest for the past week and a half. There have been different narratives and stories coming out from different negotiating parties, optimism from the United States, but then that was pulled back by the Egyptians and the Israelis. So all we know is at the moment, Gabriella, that there are talks, deep talks that are going on, but there is no agreement just yet. It appears as though from recent reports over the past 12 hours that it's Hamas that is not agreeing to certain terms within the ceasefire deal. It's Hamas that is saying no to certain conditions. But at this moment in time, you have over 130 hostages that still remain in Gaza. A number of them, where we believe are dead, are still unfortunately hidden away deep inside the subterranean cave subway system of the tunnels that Hamas has built. Now, the issue for the Israeli society is that since the first trench of released hostages, their stories have become more public. So the starvation that they endured, the lack of light, the lack of oxygen, the sexual violence, the rape, young hostage females having to shower in front of armed terrorists, and whilst they watch them. These are terrible, terrible stories that have a deep and prolonged impact on the psyche of the whole nation. So what has happened is that over time, the plight of the hostages is becoming far more important within Israeli society. That's why you're seeing these types of protests. So it's the society itself that's coming out within this vibrant democracy to say to the government, we want our people back. The stories that are horrific, that we know that they're enduring some terrible, torturous conditions in Gaza, and the country needs them out and needs them out.
Indeed. US President Joe Biden says that he hopes to have a ceasefire in the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza by Monday. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Can you give us a sense of when you think that ceasefire will start, sir?
Well, I hope by the beginning of the weekend. The end of the weekend. At least my national security advisor tells me that we're close. We're close. It's not done yet. And my hope is by next Monday, we'll have a ceasefire.
Okay, thank you.
Joel Burnie, that is US President Joe Biden eating an ice cream saying we're close, we're close. What's your read on it?
Look, on the one hand, I would love him to be right. If there was an agreement with all parties that the Israelis were happy with and hostages could be released, obviously for the exchange of Palestinian offenders in Israel, it would be great. The idea that we could have some type of lull in the war, humanitarian aid could be better sent through Gaza to get to the people that needed it. It all sounds very, very positive and optimistic. However, I've been here now for 48 hours, and that sentiment from President Biden is unfortunately not shared by anyone here, whether or not be from the hostage family side or whether or not be from government. So look, being cautious in these types of things is not a bad thing. The Egyptians are being cautious, and the Israelis are with the Qataris too. They responded to President Biden's positive comments with a little bit of caution. So my take is that I don't think we're there yet, even though many parties want to get to that outcome as soon as possible. I think it's rather optimistic to think that it will happen by the weekend. However, nothing would make me happier than being proven wrong on this.
The Times of Israel is reporting that Israel is looking into alternatives to UNRWA to distribute aid into Gaza. What progress has been made and what options can really be explored at the moment?
Now, this is a great question, Gabriella. I just came from Geneva, where I attended a conference at the United Nations, which specifically addressed the ideas that could be put forward to replace UNRWA. Now, let's just take a step back. Over the past couple of weeks in Australia alone, we've had the release of information that at least 12, and now I believe it's up to 42 UNRWA employees were directly involved in the atrocities that happened on October 7th. Not the glorification, not the celebration, but directly involved, dripping Jewish blood on their hands, at least now about 42 UNRWA employees. Now that is Australian taxpayer dollars paying specific people, terrorists, listed terrorists who are killing Jews. So the idea that in response to concerns raised about UNRWA, the Jewish community in Australia is told not only by our foreign minister, but by senior members of DFAT, that there are no alternatives to UNRWA, and the need is to get the funding back to UNRWA as soon as possible. And I pause on that and I say to myself, is that actually the priority? Obviously, getting as much aid into Gaza is as important as ever. The people in Gaza need it, and the distribution of aid is critically important. However, everyone needs to understand that in war or in conflict or in disaster zones anywhere around the world, there are a plethora of UN-based humanitarian organizations that are equipped to distribute the aid that is required. The UNRWA is unique exclusively to the Palestinians. It is an organization that has been infiltrated and infested with terror elements, and the idea that we will resume funding to UNRWA at all costs, whilst we know that Australian taxpayer dollars are going to the pockets and lining the pockets of actual terrorists, is an untenable situation. There should not be a choice of Palestinian aid versus the lives of Jewish people. So this conference looked at specific ways that other organizations like the World Food Programme, like UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, all of these different organizations that already exist within the institution of the United Nations can be deployed into Gaza. Now, the benefit of that is that the distribution of aid will be done by people that are not connected to the infested and toxic organization and being completely overrun by terrorists. You would bring in new organizations onto the ground. It will take time. It will be difficult, and there will need to be a transition period to take the responsibilities of UNRWA and give them to other organizations. But make no mistake, this organization of the United Nations that receives a large amount of taxpayer dollars from Australia is a toxic organization that does nothing but perpetuates this conflict. The fact that they deliver aid is no excuse for the fact that they have employees that kill Jews. So we need to find alternatives. There are alternatives, and I would like the conversation to be steered to looking at those alternatives instead of saying there isn't any other alternative. We need to get aid there, so let's get the money there, and we'll sort out the other stuff later. Now, I'll add one final point. A senior member of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade during Senate estimates a couple of weeks ago accused organizations like mine and other like-minded organizations of having an agenda where we provide false misinformation purely to get our end of wanting to wrap up UNRWA. Now, I want to make one thing clear. To gaslight the Jewish community when clear evidence has been submitted that UNRWA employees who were receiving a salary from that organization that Australian taxpayer dollars goes to, instead of saying that this is terrible, we need to stop, we need to look at alternatives, in that Senate estimates briefing, it was, well, these Jewish organizations have an agenda, and historically, they at all costs will provide any information, true or not, to meet their ends. I reject that wholeheartedly. I push back on that strongly. And we need to look at alternatives to make sure that the outcome is the same. And that is the immediate and efficient delivery of aid without it going through the hands of Hamas.
Well said, Joel Burnie. It's so important. We need to be having those conversations and looking very closely about those alternatives. Just finally, before I let you go, we are still seeing anti-Semitism take place around the world. Just last week, Jerry Seinfeld was targeted. Let's take a look. Joel, we're still seeing protesters make anti-Semitic chants. What's your sense on where we're at the moment? Are there signs that this is slowing down at all?
No, unfortunately not. I think it's picking up steam. And I'll tell you why it's picking up steam. It's picking up steam because they're allowed to do it and they can do whatever they want. It appears as though that when there is a clash where a violent and very loud pro-Palestinian group is accosting Jews, even in downtown Melbourne, and saying horrific things. From all the video footage that I've seen, it's been the police that have been manhandling the Jews and removing them. So this takes leadership, Gabriella. This takes leadership from the top. This takes leadership to call out anti-Semitism without conflating it with anything else, such as Islamophobia or other prejudices to minorities. Now, I want to make myself abundantly clear: Islamophobia is a problem in Australia, and there has been a statistical uptick in Islamophobia since the events of October 7. However, that pales in statistical comparison with the uptick of anti-Semitic attacks. So whilst you're addressing the major problem that we have on the streets of Australia, the disharmony within the Australian community, and when every time the government talks about tackling anti-Semitism, the next two words that come out of their mouths is and Islamophobia. And I think that this is a problem. So it takes the leadership from the top to say that we, as Australians, do not like this behaviour on our streets. We as Australians will push back against this behaviour on our streets. And we as Australians, and at the top through our enforcement agencies, will make sure that all Australians, including Jews, are free to be who they want to be and be free without the abuse that they receive on the streets. Now, I've had my daughter's school carnival late last year was moved from a public oval back behind their 8-foot-high walls because of security concerns. We've got kids that are taking off their Jewish symbols because they're afraid because they're being attacked. This is a problem that is getting worse and worse and worse. It's up to the enforcement authorities to understand exactly what the problem is, and also to understand that just because you have an unruly mob and that they may outnumber the amount of Jews, it is not appropriate to target the one or two Jews that got pushed to the ground and be called supporting genocide, to then pluck them out, physically remove them, and say that they're the problem because they're breaching the peace. There needs to be a realignment with our leadership. It needs to come from the top, and there needs to be a better understanding from our enforcement agencies as to exactly what the problem is.
Joel Burnie, Executive Manager at the Australia-Israel Jewish Affairs Council, thank you so much for coming on the program. We really appreciate all the effort you have made. Thank you so much, Joel.
Thanks, Gabriella. Thank you for having me.